Hey everybody, welcome back to Men Need to Be Heard. It's Dan, and I've got another exciting show for you. So, as you all know, my passion and the reason I do this is really to help men and boys out, to make them aware of issues that they're facing, speak out on those issues, raise awareness for the public, all that good stuff. And as much as I like to say that I do a lot, I like to have other people on who I feel are doing more than I am, and I want them to be able to share what they're doing. And really, the goal behind all of that is to show men that they're not alone. I talked to literally hundreds of guys every week and month and so forth. And a lot of them feel it's just me. I'm alone and nobody's fighting for us. And my guest today is fighting for us, and I want to bring him on. His name is Sean Kullman. Let me bring you on. Sean, how you doing, my friend?
I'm feeling well, Dan. How are you, buddy?
I am fantastic. So Sean is the president of the Global Initiative for Boys and Men, and he's also an editor for a Substack. Sean, what is the name of your Substack?
In his words, .us.
And you were telling me, is it a weekly article on there?
Yeah, you usually do we do a weekly article, and overwhelmingly it has data in it, and I think that's what legitimizes the articles. I know a lot of researchers and others go to it. Policymakers have gone to it, just to even parents because they want to know, well, what's the data on particular things.
Mm-hmm.
As we'll get into later, Dan. We cover six primary areas.
Yeah, well, and we're going to get into each one of those. And what I love about what you're doing is one of the things that I often face because I've done lobbying. I did lobbying in New York State. I've been to D.C. a couple times. That's a whole other ballgame. But I did of lobbying in New York, primarily for shared parenting, but also on other men's issues. We tried to get a domestic violence shelter and so forth. And all we ever heard was, "What's the data? What's the data? What's the data?" Show us the data. Although half the time when we did show them the data, they didn't believe it anyway. But I do think things are getting better along those lines. So I applaud you for what you're doing. Before we dive into that, though, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, just on a personal level, whatever you wish to share?
Yeah, sure. So I've been involved in these issues for well over a decade. Really, I'd say 2 decades. I started out in teaching. I used to be in personal fitness. That's something Dan and I have in common. And so, I started to notice disparities happening quite a bit. And I started doing more and more research. So I taught at the high school level and the college level, even at one point middle school. And I'm married. I have two boys and very happy. Got a lovely wife and the kids are great and I enjoy our family time. And doing this type of work is more than just a love of my children. It really is trying to address a social issue. I mean, I love that Dan's podcast is Men Need to Be Heard, and something we'll touch on later, which is the male narrative in the public discourse. And why I think it's important what you're doing, Dan, is that it contributes to that public discourse and that social narrative, which is often overlooked. And that's what really brought me into this arena. So
Go ahead.
in 2019, we established the Global Initiative for Boys and Men, which is a perfect time right before an international pandemic. And so
Yeah, that must
it
have been it. That must have been interesting trying to start an organization in the middle of a pandemic.
yeah, and it was interesting. So one of the things that we noticed is that there was definitely a need in this space. And while some were working at kind of the federal level, we found that there needed to be work at the state level as well. And so we created a nonprofit with the sole purpose of doing research and advocacy on the behalf of boys and men. We've had lots of mothers coming to us saying, "My son is struggling in school," or "My son can't find a job," or he doesn't like college," or whatever it may be. And so we started quantifying all of this and showing policymakers and others that it's time for us to move forward and really look at things like state policy councils to educate legislators.
And to your point on that, that is something that is critical at this point. As I said, I've been lobbying for decades. Or, well, I did. I haven't done it recently. And you see all the initiatives that were done for women and girls starting back in the early '70s, and I applaud them. By the way, absolutely applaud them. The pendulum did need to swing a little bit. It was too far for the boys. They needed to address, for example, education. They needed to make some changes and all that. Um, and but I think they went too far the other way. And now, and we'll get into this in a little bit more in depth. But when you look at things like education, boys are lagging very far behind the girls at this point. And we're seeing it across society in different areas. And that's where we're going to delve into those things. But I applaud you for starting this because it is something that we need to be doing. One of the things I think guys struggle with is one, as I said earlier, they think it's just them. It's not. It's across the breadth of men and boys. It really is. And the more we speak out, the more information we share, both our stories or data or whatever, it'll drive policy a little bit more so that we can get some focus on things like men unaliving themselves or the host of issues, and I'm sure we'll dive into some of them. So your initial reason for doing it is you kind of saw what was going on, Sean. But how did you get to the point where you said I need to do an organization and kind of go from there?
So I'd written a piece in the New York Times and then was connected to people who've been in this policy arena, or I should really say the writing arena for a long time. People like Warren Farrell, author of The Boy Crisis and Myth of Male Power. And then I got hooked up with a group of others. And then after working with them for some time, I realized there needed to be an organization specifically dedicated to educating policymakers, not just at the national level, but at the state level, because there's more buy-in. And so part of it really happened by meeting others like Warren Farrell, Michael Gurian, and others in this field who have been doing this work for decades and finding success.
It's funny you mentioned Warren Farrell. He's my hero. He's also my get for this podcast. If you can help me out, my friend, I would kill to get Warren on. Dr.
Okay.
Farrell, as I call him. I've read everything he's ever written, and he's very good at what he does. And he's not, for those that don't know who he is, Warren Farrell started in the 60s and 70s, and he was actually on the board for the National Organization of Women now. And he calls himself a feminist, I think still. But he saw what was going on, much like you said you did, right? And what he writes about and talks about is all the things that we're talking about, the issues that boys face. It's funny that you mentioned his book about boys. I'm actually re-listening to that as we speak. It's something I keep coming back to because there's so much information in there that I want to help spread the word on also, and I'm sure you do too. See, he's a great man. So kudos to you
I'll,
for.
I'll let him know. I'm personal friends with Warren, so
Oh,
maybe
are you real? Well,
in the email. Yeah, we and he's got he has a new version coming out.
oh, does
Not
he
sure
really?
when, but the Myth of Male Power, which
Okay.
is going to be a new book coming. It's going to be a whatever edition, a new anniversary edition, but it's going to be reworked. It should be excellent. And so I'm looking forward to that when it comes out. I'm hoping to, be involved with him.
Yeah, he's a great man. All right, so you decided to create the organization. What would you say are your top missions and goals behind the organization? You kind of touched on it already, but can you be a little bit more specific and in detail on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly important that every state in the country produce a state report on the status of boys and men. We just don't do it. So it's hard to address policy if you don't know what's happening.
Hmm.
And so, for example, I've met with policymakers, and they don't know that 77% of their opioid deaths in California are male. And they almost do a double take, and they say, "What was that number?" And when you tell them, they're shocked.
Hmm.
And so, in many levels, they're uninformed. And so, our goal is to do the research and advocacy component. And that advocacy really happens in educating policymakers, educating school boards, educating the public. So knowing what they should be doing and advocating for. So that's really what our impetus is. And that is in creating state reports. And that's really been our mandate this year. And we've produced a number of them. You can see them on our website at gibn.us and just look at state reports for those that we have completed. Our state report in New Mexico, we're going to be presenting at the University of New Mexico on September the 28th. And that's being co-sponsored by Sigma Alpha Epsilon.
That's awesome. So, to kind of go along with what you were saying, when I was doing my lobbying back in the day, You would go in with statistics. The deer in the headlights look. I'd see it all the time. What do you mean? On various issues. And I think a lot of it is because we men don't speak out. Um, you know, I've always talked about if I were walking around, it's the LOB in New York, Legislative Office Building. So everybody calls it the LOB or LOB. As I was walking around, there'd be 24 women's groups walking around, and I was there pretty much every day because I worked a couple blocks from it. I used to walk up at my lunch hour and I'd meet with one or two, either assemblymen or senators or senate women or whatever. And I would share with them things like you're talking about, hey, I found this data, things from Warren's books, as a matter of fact. All right. And I would say, did you realize this? And they would just, what do you mean? Because they've heard from the women's groups, but they don't hear from the men's groups. And if there's one thing that I hope people take away from this is the work you're doing, take that as a leadership and follow along and become an advocate and get up and speak, because the more of us that do speak, the sooner things will change. At least just my little opinion on that. What do you think?
Well, no, and it's important because people have to understand that policy actions are really determined on what gets in front of legislators. So if you're interested in the education of your child, whether that is a boy or a girl, if information isn't getting to them, well, policy decisions are being made and they don't really have all the data.
Mm-hmm.
And so most importantly, schools is where it needs to take place so they can kind of go from the bottom up. But I want to touch on something, Dan, you addressed earlier, and that was really the organization of women's groups to advocate for themselves in the 1970s and continue.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a little bit of I think there needs to be a little bit of an explanation in that arena, and this is what I mean. So there needed to be some work for women to get into college and promote and encourage them into all types of professions. But I look at this a very different way. And so the biggest influx of men into the university system happened after World War II. And so essentially through the GI Bill. So it was recompense for services rendered. That's how men found their way to college. Well, those men had children. And when they had children, they had sons and daughters, and they wanted their daughters to get an education.
Mm-hmm.
The difference in the influx of women and men into college, I think, comes across with two different paths. The one for men was recompense for services rendered, and the one for women was civil rights. We made it a civil right, and that civil right became what it is today. And the pendulum has swung a little too far in the context of from 2016 to 2020, there were like 2.85 million more women who earned degrees than men.
Mm-hmm.
So, or 2.8 million, it's right around there somewhere. And so my point being, we saw advocating for women as a civil right. I don't think we ever saw it that way for men. And we have to realize that the economy was changing. The world was changing. We went from people who worked on farms and people who worked in little factories and all that sort of thing, and that the family unit was the structure of anything. And a mother had to stay home, right, to tend to the children and things like that. Well, with modern inventions, things were able to change. Women were now able to enter the workforce. And because they were able to enter the workforce, we promoted and encouraged that. They wanted to get into medicine, or they wanted to get into law and other sorts of professions. And that sort of happened. The challenge was at that time, as the economy changed, and if you look now 50 years later, as the primary services that men went into, like manufacturing, those things started to decrease. And what started to increase? Teaching, nursing, which are overwhelmingly female professions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when we really look at the women's movement and its move into a modern economic society, we have to realize what really happened. And I think part of it is we still have this civil rights advocacy on behalf of women, which is it's perfect, but we need it for men too. And what's come out of that is an incredible number of nonprofits and advocacy agencies supported by federal government, state government, and private donors to continue their advancement. But nothing has been really done for men. I mean, there's an Office of Women's Health, and there isn't an Office of Men's Health.
Right.
The last time I checked, both get sick.
Well, it's funny. You touched on two things that I've been talking about a lot lately on my various social medias. In the UK right now, there's a big push to have a minister for men. and there's a ton of blowback on it. And I've even seen videos where they said, well, this is not fair. Why should there be a minister for men? They don't realize there already is a minister for women. We're just asking for the same thing. And I remember 10, 15 years ago, there was I forget the exact term for it, but it was the Office of Girls and Women that Obama administration had wanted to put through. There isn't one for men. And again, we don't want to take anything away from women. That's a misnomer that a lot of people don't really understand. We're not looking to take anything away from women or girls or any programs or anything. We're just simply saying we need the same thing for boys and men. That in a nutshell is what it comes down to. And to your point about the way things have changed, manufacturing jobs going away, you hear the push for women to get into STEM, and I'm all for that. I've tried to get my daughters into it back in the day. But you never hear the other side of it, which is HEAL, right? Basically healthcare education, right? There's no push to get boys into those. Yet, if you look at the statistics 10, 15, 20, 50 years down the road, STEM's going to grow, but it's somewhere around 25% of the growth that HEAL is going to have. So we're taking away, and the more we automate, there's less manufacturing jobs. We're taking away the jobs, the traditional male jobs, but we're not giving them something to replace it with. I'm wondering if you see the same type of things.
For sure. And Richard Reeves writes about the healed
Yes,
professions in
yes.
Boys and Men, right? So I know Richard, and he's talking about the need, and it's going to be a combination of things. I don't know if you recently read Rubio's report on working and non-working men. Senator, Marco Rubio of Florida. We just wrote about it last week, actually.
I have read, or not, I've seen bullet points on it. I have not read the actual report, but I did have a couple of things where I saw bullet points basically.
Essentially what he's looking for is I don't think he's against what Reeves is saying, but he's saying there needs to be more. And so
Mm-hmm.
what he's really probably calling for is a collaboration between, corporations, education, government to create environments where these types of jobs do have a place. Automated jobs, right, in manufacturing, things like that, that men can train for who don't want to go into the academic world. They want to work with their hands, or they want to work with automation in a way that is not a traditional path of go get a bachelor's degree, but maybe a trades path. I think both of them actually are supportive of that agenda. And so I think if you want, you can just read the short version on our website where we kind of summarize it. We kind of blend in what Reeves is saying and others around this issue. But we really haven't prepared some men, for those kind of jobs where there's real growth. And the biggest growth really has been in things like education and nursing and other professions.
Well, a very interesting point. I know someone that runs a nursing home as an executive director for a nursing home. And I was talking with her and I said, what is your staff ratio? And it's damn near 100 to 0. I mean, at minimum, it's 90% female. And these are positions that they're desperate to fill. Some are not the best paying, let's be honest about it, but a lot of them are very well paying, but they can't get anyone. And then I had the conversation go, well, why aren't you reaching out to men? And the belief they have is that men aren't interested in that. And I'm like, there may be a kernel of truth to that, but I think it's more because we're not encouraging them to be interested in it. Where go do this, meaning go to college, get a degree in finance or whatever, as opposed to a degree in, say, nursing. What do you think about that?
I mean, nursing is actually a great profession for men. There are very few professions in nursing where you do see a decent level of men in it, and those tend to be very specific areas of nursing. But overall, they're a very small
Yeah.
percentage.
And what
And
was
so I think there's a real need to have men in that profession, and it takes a particular type of man to see that.
what's interesting too is if you look at it from the patient's perspective, and she brought this up too, is you look at how many men versus women in nursing home. It's about 3 to 1 female to male, but the men, if they have to be toileted, they have a female nurse doing it. It's embarrassing to the men, right? They don't want that. And it's a struggle for them. So again, it speaks that there's a need out there, but it's a need no one's talking about. You know,
You get at something more important is the whole entire healthcare industry
yes.
needs we need way more male psychologists and male social workers. And so social working, I mean, it's tough work. I have sister-in-laws who are in social work, and I can tell you, but we need more men in those professions, particularly at different stages. But the psychology departments today are so underrepresented, and the men who are in it are feeling alienated more and more and more, even as they begin to talk about the outcomes of males.
Mm-hmm.
And so there hasn't been enough of a push, I think, to get men into those professions. And so they're all connected, you know, the nursing, social work, psychology, it's about caring, right? That, you know, they're caring professions. And we absolutely need men in those fields. And a lot of men are looking at sports psychology. You know, they're looking at those issues, and you know, you need maybe a few more in family counseling for sure, and other areas of mental health.
You know, it's funny when I work with men because you know, I have a couple of men's groups that I work with, and we're looking for opportunities for health care or mental wellness care. Um, a lot of them don't want to go to a female therapist or whatever. There's so few males, especially for the younger ones. I know I read a statistic not too long ago, but it's something like 80% of the therapists under, I think it was 35, maybe been 30, are female. So there's a dearth, and it speaks to these are opportunities that are out there for men and boys um, that we should be talking about, yet no one is.
But even things like the American Psychological Association, I think need to do significantly more to advance the causes of men. And I don't think they have. I'm just going to call it out for what it is. And part of that begins with promoting men into the field of psychology.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, they have presented outcomes focus more on women's needs. There is, you know, some people attempting to, and you know, when you, I don't even can't even fathom that, understanding that a male might prefer a male therapist and a female might prefer a female therapist, not in all causes or not for all instances. I can tell you there's a woman, Ann Silvers. She's a family counselor in Washington State, and she works with men who are abused
Mm-hmm.
men, and she's tremendous with them. And just, you know, she has a place and a niche, but she also sees the need for males in the field, not only to work with patients, but also she sees the need to get a different perspective, because the perspective tends to come from the masses,
Mm-hmm.
and there isn't another perspective. And so there needs to be a social push to get men into those professions.
Yeah, I agree with her in a lot of ways, but I do see the need for. So, as someone who's a survivor of sexual assault and domestic violence, the DV, I can see where, and again, I ran a peer group for male victims of domestic violence. Going to a female therapist or counselor for that is very difficult. And I'm not faulting the counselor or therapist in any way, shape, or form. It's just they don't feel comfortable because that's who they were abused by. All right. And I went through this. I went through many different therapists, and it was ultimately a male that helped me out. And again, I'm not in any way, shape, or form knocking the female therapist, but I always had this, I'm not going to open up fully to them. I'm not going to make myself vulnerable. So again, it's not a universal thing, but there are instances where a man might be more comfortable speaking with another man about this. And
Yeah, and you have to be pretty savvy. I mean, she's really savvy,
mm-hmm.
and I think she has ways to really attract men and get them to open up their vulnerabilities. But you know, you get back to an important point about domestic abuse. Most people don't understand, and I think Phil Cook, who wrote "Abused Men: Inside of Domestic Violence," explains this very, very well. And that is that people who are in abusive relationships, in many instances when it's physical, there are, you know, it's 50-50 long-term abusive relationships,
Yes, it is.
under the assumption that men are just more of the abuser, and that just isn't the case. And this is being proven time and time and time again. And even the CDC, when it created its Adverse Child Experience survey, which is a well-regarded survey, it missed out on questions that didn't ask survivors if they witnessed their father being abused or their stepfather or their mother's boyfriend. But they did ask if they watched their mother be abused or their stepmother or their mother or their father's girlfriend, things like that. And so that, they've changed it since and made it more neutral, but they kind of still stand by the old survey. And so I think that's an example of a perfect failing. Had there been more male psychologists and sociologists involved in that, they would say, well, wait a minute, we can't do that.
Mhm.
We have to ask for both. But there was really no one to step in and do that.
Yeah, I mean, it creates an inherent bias in whatever the results are because you're only getting one side of the coin, so to speak. I think back to early 2000s. There was a study being done on how representative was male victim of domestic violence in the domestic violence, I call it an industry. And that study got shut down because they were finding out, as you mentioned, I think the number is somewhere around 70% of it is mutual, goes both ways. And they were finding out of the remaining 30%, women and men were abusers at about equal rates. You know.
Yeah, and so yeah, it's interesting, and even you need to break the groups down even further. If you break the groups down into things like heterosexual male, heterosexual female, homosexual female, that kind, or lesbian female. If you go back and forth in lesbian relationships, homosexual relationships, heterosexual relationships, the data is almost never disaggregated that way,
Mm-hmm.
right? And because when you do that, you get a very different understanding of abuse, domestic abuse, that it's a human problem. It's not a male problem, it's a human problem. And I don't know how you even can quantify, I don't care what someone would say the numbers are, that one person's dignity or safety is less relevant to somebody else's. And it brings you back to what you were talking about earlier, Dan. And you talked about Obama's, the Office of Women's Health. What's interesting is Warren Farrell was asked to be on that committee. I'm sorry, the Commission on the Status of Women and Girls, that under the Obama administration, and Warren was asked to be on that committee. But he said, what about one for boys and men? And so he got a group of people together, some of the leading experts in the country, and they created this proposal, which of course never went through. But what's important to remember about that is it's a perfect example of creating something. And so the Biden administration picked up on that. They have something called the White House Gender Policy Council. It's not a gender policy council. It specifically says in its mandate it's for women and girls. And so it's not a gender policy council. And that's part of what happens. It suggests inclusiveness when in reality it's exclusive.
Yeah, it's that political game. You get the fancy name that sounds good, but what's underneath behind it is usually
And we
something
have to
entirely different.
understand that boys and girls are affected in different ways and they react in different ways. They may gravitate towards certain things in different ways. And we have to make sure that we're attending to their needs as boy and girl and male and female and young man, young female, middle aged. And there are different ways that they react. And there are different, and people think men aren't empathetic. They're absolutely empathetic. If you've ever watched men, coaches or fathers, and they may do it differently. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit because we got a New Yorker here and then we got an original Philly guy. People don't know, there was a game the Phillies were in. It was like, I think it was the Marlins. And Alec Boehm, the third baseman, made an error. I mean, it really cost them the game essentially toward an inning. And people don't realize it, but it was Stott and I think and Turner walked over. They didn't say a word to him. They just stood there,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they knew what could happen with the crowd or things. And he just felt awful. An error is an error. It happens in professional sports. But what they were doing at that moment is they were comforting him. And if they didn't go over and hug him and they just stood there, hey, we're here with you, brother. Right? It happens all of us. Didn't say a word. They just
Yep.
stood there in the moment and then they moved on. So men are empathetic and they express it in different ways. And that goes back to why we need councils and things like that that look at how the male psyche responds and the female psyche responds. There's something on that we can talk about later in the field of education too, Dan.
Well, that kind of gives me the opportunities to kind of shift a little bit, but stay within the same realm. So the organization's got six primary areas of focus: education, jobs, careers, fatherhood, criminal justice. I'm forgetting the last two. Help me out.
But the male narrative in the public discourse,
That's it.
physical mental health, fatherhood, family
Thank you.
relationships. I think we got them all. Criminal justice and court systems for sure.
I want to kind of look at each one of those, talk about what you see as the issue with them and what you're looking at through the organization to kind of help drive solution or even offer solutions, and go through each one a little bit. Spend a few minutes on each one if you don't mind. And I'd like to start with education, if that's okay, because that is one of my big ones that I've been pushing this month because kids are going back to school. So I did a live in early September where I talked about how boys are lagging in school and gave a ton of data about it and all that. And I had people on there from all over the world. And this is what I found interesting is we tend to think in the United States that it's a US problem, if we even recognize that it's a US problem. But the UK, and then we had the discussion kind of morph a little bit. Well, it's the Western, quote unquote, Western countries. But then I had people chiming in from Asia saying, no, we're dealing with it too. This is a global issue for education. So, can you talk a little bit about what your goal is to kind of raise awareness on the issues of education and, where we're at right now, what you think we need to be doing?
I'm happy. It's funny because I would like to start with education too. So that
Okay,
worked out.
great.
So I think that, everything begins with the education. I'm just going to start off with one statistic as we're preparing a new state report for California, really comprehensive for a event. We're going to be holding multiple town halls throughout the state of California. And we're going to be culminating in the spring of 2024 with a new report on the status of boys and men in California. But I'll tell you this, 89% of the suspensions in kindergarten through third grade are male. So right then you have a problem. What you're telling them is that you're a problem. Mm-hmm. Now, certainly some suspensions are warranted, but what I can tell you is boys are being suspended for ridiculous things, and they're always hurt with the no tolerance policies, and some of it is not even about tolerance. And I'll give you the perfect example. Whether people agree or disagree, is the boy in Colorado who was suspended for wearing a "Don't Tread on Me" flag on his backpack, or not pulled out of class. Mm-hmm. He was suspended. I'm sorry, I had to correct myself. He was pulled out of class, right? Now, for having a flag on his jacket. But that's just like one example. They were suspended for all types of things. So boys learn at a very early age that school is not for them. Many of them. I'm not saying all of them, but many of them. And secondly, the pedagogical methods just have to change. And they can't, because more often than not, schools conflate data and they get it wrong. If a school district or a school is not disaggregating its data at the intersection of both race and sex, it is always wrong. So if you're not doing it by Asian male, Asian female, black female, etc., it's always going to be wrong, and you're always going to conflate the data. Because what our studies have repeatedly shown again and again and again in every single state is that all boys of all races are behind their female counterparts in reading. They're behind their female counterparts in attending college, graduating from college, and this is going to happen no matter where you look. So it begins with an honest conversation about disaggregating the data. And I can tell you, when you ask districts for certain information, they will put up roadblocks and you've got to blow by them and get the information. And so number one is, let's disaggregate the data honestly and look at why are boys at all grade levels behind girls in reading, at every grade level. And then if you disaggregate it further, it's not just boys, it's actually by each race. And so we need to begin, first, let's be honest about the data and say, what are we not doing for boys? And I do believe there's different schools of thought. You have the Richard Reeves, notion that, I don't think this is, I wouldn't say this, maybe it's all of it's in the basket or not, but there's a cognitive lag, and that very well there's some truth to that for sure. And there's also like the Gurian model, where he believes that boys and girls learn differently. And there's certainly truth in that.
Mhm.
And I know as a teacher that that is true. We have to look at how boys and girls learn differently. And that can work in conjunction with things like, is there a cognitive lag with boys where they're not ready for certain skills? But that doesn't deny the fact that they do have different ways of learning. Now, that's of course going to be in the aggregate, right? There's going to be exceptions, up and down that scale. But for the most part, our schools need to start addressing those differences. They also need to start being a little bit more understanding of presenting the data in an accurate way. A perfect example was a school district I'm in, Pleasanton, California, was talking about suspension data, and it talked about this systemic race problem. Well, it didn't have that problem. It had a systemic sex problem, right? Because all
Mhm.
boys were suspended. And if you looked at the top five, they were all male. And so that's a perfect example of a school district not disaggregating data the right way because it's falling into a social narrative. And we have to realize that that information, and it is essential. And I don't think parents know that you look at your school district and you're going to find that all boys are behind in reading at every grade level.
Yeah, there are exceptions here and there, but by and large, that's exactly right. Question I have for you, because I did K 12, and I've talked about this before, for a couple of years. I was the technology manager, technology director, whatever the hell my title was. And I saw behind the scenes what was going on a little bit. That's why I got out, to be honest with you, because I was appalled. When you talk about the data and all that, do you think it's because they just don't know, or do you think there's more? I don't want to use the term nefarious, but more something behind it where they don't want this data getting out. I don't know where I lean on that. I was just curious what you think.
I mean, I'm generally skeptical, which is why I always go to the data.
Yeah.
And so I do think when I presented data to school board members, they're shocked. They just had no idea. And a lot of it has to do because they don't know to look. So I think there's integrity and lack of knowledge. And then I think there are programs that sort of supersede any of that. So let me give a perfect example. Some example. So I asked a district for information that would disaggregate student test scores by age
Mm-hmm.
in their grade. So, for example, an 8-year-old who's in third grade who was born in January versus a nine-year old. Let's break those things down and see if we see any differences, which is kind of the Reeves argument, right? And so let's do that. Well, the pushback on that is unbelievable. And there's no you don't have to give names. You can remove the names. You can aggregate the data. There's all sorts of ways to do it, and our ways. So those are the kind of things we need to look at and see if there really are outcomes. But like I said before, but when you see patterns where all boys are behind of all races in reading, well, maybe we're not doing something right, right? And so I actually think that school boards need to become incredibly more active in securing data and sharing it with the public. It's not the superintendent's job. It's a school board's job to demand it. I want this data, and we've created a template that any district can use. Just get the data, plug in the numbers, and share it with the public, so you can begin to address the real issues. I'll give you another example of how girls have been hurt with math in the past, where reports come back, tests come back, standardized tests, and a girl isn't doing well and at a young age. And you say, okay, that can't be true, the teacher says, because she's sitting quietly, she's doing her work. Well, what the study found was teachers were confusing skill acquisition with behavior. The boy's bouncing around and and crushing his test, and the girl isn't. Well, what happened was quietly doing your work means you know what you're doing. No, it doesn't. Which is why the data in that was important, so that you knew, oh wait, concepts aren't being toward a person is a concept, I need to get it. So both boys and girls are hurt when we don't do that. And school boards need to be the ones to step in and say, and there's a template available. I mean, I honestly believe that parents in a school district and the community should have a full report every year. The data's already there, presented on how kids are doing, disaggregated the way I would disaggregate it.
Yeah, I mean, the data is there. I can tell you because, like I said, I worked in IT. I know they're collecting it. I know where they're getting it from, and so forth. And You bring up an interesting point about the school boards. Every board is different. A lot of them, though, are parents, and they don't know to ask, and that's why I'm leery to say that there's some agenda behind it or anything like that. I genuinely think there's a gap in their knowledge of what to ask for. I think that is part of it. I also think that there are some out there that do have an agenda, if we're being honest and fair, and it's somewhere in the middle. But the key point that we all need to be doing as parents or as citizens is going to the school board and saying, hey, I want this data. Provide me the data. I've done it in the past. They'll, like you said, they'll look at you like, what data? What are you talking about? Sometimes, or others will say, oh, we can't get that for you. You can get it. It's public record. Yeah, I mean, it's
Well, and even still, sometimes there's, I know there's one district where we're now looking at a next step because they haven't supplied the data, and so there is going to be a next step, and so I will eventually get the data. And again, the issue isn't to be problematic. It is to say, look, here's what the data says. How are you addressing the data? And even in schools, there needs to be a lot more, especially for the boys. There needs to be a lot, and then for the girls, I mean, they benefit as well. More hands-on activities.
mm-hmm.
There needs to be much more hands-on activities and actually applying subject matter. And so getting kids to move around more. I think Gurian does an exceptional job of this, about talking about how boys and girls learn differently, and really the neuroscience and what's going on inside the brain. Let me give a perfect example. The in the aggregate, if you split the brain in its left and right hemisphere, the the girl brain is cross talking. Left and right hemisphere are connected and talking horizontally. The boy brain is split in its two hemispheres, and it's really going vertically, and fewer connections across the hemispheres, right? And they tend to be, the prefrontal cortex is not as stimulated as the girl's prefrontal cortex. And so what does that mean? Executive function is higher
Mm-hmm.
in the girl. And so the sitting in the classroom and the listening, it happens a little bit easier. And so I'll give you, this is the analogy I always use. I was used to be the managing editor of a journal of medical toxicology. And so there's all this cool stuff. I'd fix all the doctor writing. And so I managed a journal. Well, snake bite season comes out, and poison control center stuff, and what happens, what to watch for. Well, where are most people bit? Well, most people are bit below the knee. Where are boys bit? In the hand. Snake. They reach for it. That executive function isn't happening. And so understanding what's going on in the brain when you're learning, and CAT scans and MRIs, we're learning so much incredible information now, that what is going on in the brain when you learn, and how do you stimulate the brain to learn. And there are differences. And that's one of the things that we're not addressing more openly. Some school districts are, and some schools are, but it needs to be a much broader conversation.
Well, that's a conversation though that a lot of places aren't allowing. They don't want to have that discussion, because I've run into this about the differences, biological differences in a nutshell, between how boys think, between how girls think, between how men think, between how women think. It's become almost taboo in some areas. And I always bring it out as, look, men have their strength, boys have their strength, girls have their strength. Our weakness as men tends to be the girls' strengths. And I'm not just talking intelligence, I'm just talking the breadth of everything. And we should be celebrating the differences, acknowledging them, and then making our policies and our curriculum, in particular in education, based on the strengths and the best way that's going to fit for the average. The other thing they'll always throw out at you is the exceptions, right? There's always going to be the boys that will be fine sitting in a classroom for 6 hours. There's going to be girls that need that structured recess time and so forth. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But we've gotten to the point where we can't even have the conversation in many cases, and that gets frustrating to me, because they're trying to homogenize everything. They being the
Easier.
many school
It's
districts.
easier. It's easier to manage it
It
that way.
is. Well, that you just went to the point I was going to make, is because it makes it easier for the teachers, I think, but it also frustrates the teacher. I talk to teachers, and they get very frustrated, because there's some really good teachers out there that recognize that, say, we need to be looking at this and how to teach them differently, and what is the best approach. So having said that, I want to get your opinion. What do you think are some of the changes that we should be looking at in education to kind of, I don't want to say level the playing field, but essentially level the playing field?
Well, I mean, a person will go through education, getting a degree in education, studying all the pedagogical methods. They will never go through a course where they're going to learn about boys and girls differences and how the brain, even as a theory or a concept,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I think that the diversity, equity, and inclusion model, which is not scientific in any way, shape, or form, and it's not to say that we don't need to look at things in different ways, but we're not even discussing what's happening inside the brain, and teachers aren't aware of what's happening inside the brain as part of their pedagogical training.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where we need to begin. I think at least some of that needs to work its way in. The other thing is we need to look at, um, teachers need to have. I actually think principals need to be more accountable for their schools. More often than not, they're wonderful people doing great jobs, but they're really their arms are being tied a little bit by the central office.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think principals actually need more autonomy, and that what that will do is that will force relationships between teachers and principals to be even more cooperative. And at the end of the day, they need to look at the test results and see, hey, what's going on? Why isn't this happening? Why isn't that happening? But what you're also going to learn is you're going to have schools that are going to have new ways of getting information and sharing plans and sharing lesson plans that another school didn't think of.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's centralized top down, there's very little innovation, which is maybe the reason the majority of boys across the country are not reading at grade level. And so I think we need to look at really all those issues. But as so that's one thing we can actively do. We can teach boys and girls learn differently as a concept and how it exercises itself in a lesson plan in the classroom, not one day, not 2 day, but over a course of an entire year. So that's one thing we can actually do. The second thing we need to do is make learning more active.
Mm-hmm.
A portion of the day is academic, and a portion of the day has to be toward projects, application of the knowledge. And those are things I think we should absolutely employ.
Yeah, it's funny because you're touching on my solutions basically, which one is things like recess or playtime, whatever you want to call it, especially for the younger kids, I think are critical. And I understand the drive that we need that time for effectively STEM or reading and whatever, but it takes away from the kids being able to step back away from the desk a little bit. And the other side of it is you have opportunities within that to teach skills. I always talk about, they do away with shop. When I was
Yep.
growing up, fractions elude me. All right. I can do subtraction, addition, multiplication, division. Anything past that, forget it. All right. I struggled with fractions until I took shop and I had to figure out, the measurements. And it was like, I'm using 1/16th. I forget what it was. And then the shop teacher teaching me that. And then it was like the light bulb went, oh, all right. Because I could apply it to real life. Like calculus for me, forget it. And I've never used it. So who cares? But again, for me, it was that quote unquote hands on is what enabled me to do it. So, one of the things that I talk about often that I feel, and this is just my personal opinion, is that one, that type of stuff needs to be brought back. We shouldn't be doing away with PE either. And I'm not saying that because I'm a trainer, okay, or own a gym. I'm saying it because there are valuable skills that you learn within that. Socialization being one of them, especially for boys. Boys socialize better on the playing field, if you will, or doing a game or whatever, I think, than they do sitting in the classroom. Couple other things, and I just want to throw them out because I want to get your opinions on them. I believe in redshirting boys, having them still go to kindergarten, but it should be a separate kindergarten, and then they effectively are just learning on the social skills. Because I do believe, much like Reeves talks about, there is a component there where boys lag behind. I learned this with my twins. I had boy and girl twins. We always joked that my son failed kindergarten. We held him. I had to fight the school district, and I mean it was war to hold him back. But he was not ready to move on. It was the best thing we ever did. So I believe in red shirting.
Even if you talk about that moment where you do the red shirting, That doesn't mean there doesn't need to be a cognitive approach that
Mhm.
is different, right? I'm going to tell you what most little boys are going to struggle with: fine motor skills,
Yep.
right? Gross motor skills off the charts, fine motor skills. And that tells you about kind of developmental things and what's happening in the classroom. So, in other words, they need to jump and run a little more, which is back to your phys ed component. So I want you to imagine, though, red shirting every kid in the United States. It's just the monstrosity of taking it on. But and what is it? Is it a year? Is it 6 months? Should be different starting dates, and maybe, and those are realistic things to look at, and that's why school districts should do it. Well, let's look at the reading scores of this instance.
Exactly.
Let's compare them to schools that use a gender-based approach to learning. Do they do better? So does the 6-year-old who's in, or the 8-year-old in third grade who is not in that type of school do worse than a boy who is in that type of school that uses a gender-based approach to learning? And so I think that, to get at what you're addressing, and that is, do we redshirt? I need to see more. But I will tell you that the people who redshirt the most are teachers.
They do that. To be fair, they did. And talking about my son, the teacher was my biggest advocate. She's like, "Yeah, I can pass him, but he'd be far better off if we didn't." And to your point, all I'm saying is we need to have a discussion on it. I'm not saying it's the absolute solution. I don't know. I don't think right now anyone can really conclusively say one way or the other. But it's
But
something
one of the
we.
things that will happen with that, Dan, is like the example is the information I'm looking for
Mhm.
in large numbers, and you'll start to see patterns, right? But that's incredibly important. We need to see those patterns. But even still, it's interesting. So think about middle age, a middle school boy when he starts hitting puberty. He's probably going to see something like 8 testosterone injections a day,
Mhm.
right? I mean, his energy is off the charts because testosterone is an aggression hormone, which, by the way, is not violence. Aggression and violence are two very different things. Aggression is absolutely healthy, and so you need to think about that. Think about what that boy is going through, right? I do know when girls go through, young women go through puberty, it's a little different, right? Energy things change, they're different. There's a different expression of the result of that.
Mhm.
And so we don't deal with that in school.
Yeah, they want to homogenize everything instead of acknowledging, like we talked about earlier, the differences and adapting the curriculum to that. Or
And
the
essentially, one thing you were touching on earlier too, starting Dan,
no,
is single sex schools, right? Do we put boys in a different school? And there is success with single sex education. There is. Some kids do real boys and girls do very well in that model, and some do fine in a co-ed model. But I will bet you almost in those successful co-ed models are probably smaller classes. But what you're looking at is something incredibly important, and that is we need to look at these models that really work.
mhm.
And if you incorporate other components like, is it a fatherless home? What's the economic status? When you really start to break these things down, socioeconomics and fatherlessness play a big role in the child's education. And schools need to be prepared to take that on. In a country where 40% of births are out of wedlock, schools need to realize that, especially in particular areas where there's high out of wedlock births, you may be going into a school where there really is only one person at home helping. And so I think the entire model for that school needs to change
Mhm.
completely,
Mhm.
and not by lowering the rigor, but keeping the rigor. But how do you, apply that model of education to a class or a school where you're going to have 70% of out of wedlock births in that school versus one that has, 5%,
Right.
right? It's a whole different approach.
Yeah, it's almost, they wanted to centralize education. I remember back in New York, it was all about we've got to standardize the test. And then the teachers are graded on how the results of those tests are. So they started teaching to the test. And it was all being driven by what New York State wanted. And I know for a fact that the districts were going, well, what works in, say, New York City or Buffalo is not going to work in, Albany or, in the Adirondacks. And that, I think that is part of the problem. And you bring up the different, single sex schools. I've always postulated, why aren't we looking at single sex classrooms within a school? Because one of the
You're
arguments.
allowed. That's a model I know can work. You don't have to have a single sex school. You can have a single sex class as long as it's offered for both. I mean,
Exactly.
there are
Yes. Yeah. And my
that's exactly what you can do. And I've known, um, the Goering Institute has done that,
mm,
and so you can make this work if you're open to the idea.
yeah, because they'll argue against going single sex schools. Cost is part of it, and I get that. And the other argument I've often heard is, well, then they don't socialize. Well, single sex classrooms negate not all of it, but a lot of that. And then the other side of it is we need more male teachers in the male classrooms to be role models, and we need to incentivize. We're starting to morph into some of these other areas, incentivize the men to become teachers. Um, Again, I'm not saying that's the be all end all, but we need to have these conversations. Unfortunately, they're stopping these conversations. And that's where the information that you're gathering and can provide can help us open the door to having those conversations. When you're doing that, are you seeing any success when you're going to school boards and saying, here's the data? How are they responding to that?
You know, they I think it's a really hard sell for districts to look at single sex classes within a school. They're not doing the research to expose it, and some of them some are not even entertaining it as a model. And even looking at school districts, I'm looking at schools like Title One schools where there has been incredible success in improving reading and math scores by using these types of models for boys and for girls.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But again, it goes back to parents really need to reach out to those who are maybe more knowledgeable and say, hey, what do I need for my district to really know what's going on?
Gotcha.
So they're not getting that information.
All right, so that kind of puts a bow on the education for now. Although what we're talking about it all kind of comes together. So the next thing I wanted to kind of go towards is something that I know, are passionate about, and I am because we're both working as trainers or have in the past. But the physical and mental health aspects of things for men and boys. Just initially, what are your first thoughts, and what's the organization's goals and mission with regard to that?
So yeah, and I'm going to tie it what we were talking about earlier, right?
Okay.
I think we're really hard on our boys in school, and I think it manifests itself in suspensions and expulsions. And again, it's not to say that they're not warranted, but it does say that when they're happening that high, maybe there's a problem. So what are we doing? You know, the majority of those who are medicated in school are boys, so we kind of got to drug them in order for them to sit in school, which is probably not a good start. But what you're really seeing too is this really serious problem in mental health. And when you look at suicide, overdose deaths, and alcohol deaths, they're overwhelmingly male in every single age group. And so, you're looking at, 75, 80% of your suicide deaths are male, over 70% of your overdose deaths are male, over 70% of your alcohol deaths are male. It's not a coincidence. And the numbers are growing astronomically. And you could say, well, they're increasing for males and females, which there's some truth in that. But in reality, it's so incredibly disproportionate. And this gets back to kind of your show, which is men need to be heard. So there was a 17-year-old boy who took his own life at the Lawrenceville School in New Jersey. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this.
I'm not.
And so he took his life. This is the most expensive prep school in the country. So this happens everywhere. This doesn't happen in public schools. And so there was a false allegation made, and he was investigated. And the school had, he was exonerated, but they never told him or never told his parents. Well, he took his own life, 17 years old. So the New York Times writes about this story. And in doing so, the only statistic in the story about the death of a 17-year-old boy was that girls were more depressed during COVID. And I'm fine if they talked about teen health during COVID as part of this larger conversation. But there wasn't one data point that tells you that over 86% of the deaths in that age group are male.
Right.
And so that's an example of mental health, I mean, even at the levels where you would think to see a greater level of concern and advocacy, once that boy was acute, his risk factors went up dramatically. Now, the school, for its part, has actually looked at this issue very seriously, and they're bringing in a dean of mental health, and they're going to try to make sure these kinds of things don't happen. But when you really look at the mental health and physical health of our boys, it happens in part because, you know, their career paths, their life paths in school are not heading in the right place. They're in stressful situations, and there aren't male therapists to go to. There aren't male social workers to go to. There aren't male groups to go to. And look, a lot of men are not going to sit around and expose their emotions in front of other men. They're not. But they will get together with other men and talk in other ways,
Hmm.
and they will ultimately open up in their groups. And so there's different types of males, right? I mean, it's kind of like it's going to be like an alpha male or a beta male, right? Different personality types. And there are men who are perfectly comfortable, you know, expressing their emotions and getting the help they need. And there are many men who aren't. And so we have failed, especially when you don't have an Office of Men's Health that is specifically looking at these issues and saying, what are we doing? You know, what professions are more likely to lead to alcohol addiction, drug addiction, suicide, those types of things. And it doesn't happen because we don't make a coordinated effort, even at the state level. And so, even when I've gone to policymakers and explained this happens across all racial groups, there's still this kind of attempt to deny it.
Hmm.
And so, the mental health of our men is in a serious state. And we can see it because they're the overwhelming majority of overdose deaths. And you're seeing an opioid crisis, an unprecedented opioid crisis. And they are the victims. I mean, I'd say I think there are 60 million children, boys under the age of 30, which means there are mothers out there of those 60 million boys. You should absolutely be looking at this as your number one issue. Absolutely.
I couldn't agree with you more. I do think this is the number one issue. Oh, one and one A with education. To
Yep.
be honest with
Right.
you,
They're
but
connected.
they
It's
are
all connected.
they're completely connected. This is
Your
again.
kid is
Go ahead.
If your kid is coming from a fatherless home, the increase goes up even more.
Yep.
If your kid is coming from an abusive home, it will manifest itself. And so the numbers are clear in every state report we've done. It's astronomical.
And when you talk to the policymakers, at least in my experience with it, like you said, they either they want to do this and this, but they'll also be like stunned when you start talking about depending on what you look at. The statistic I usually use is somewhere between 100 and 125 men commit suicide a day. The numbers fluctuate a little bit depending on who you talk to, and then when you break the subsets down under that, divorce is a big reason why it happens. Kids in school frustration, boys specifically, and you say to them, this is what's going on, this is the reality, and they just want to do this. And it's a huge issue because it's affecting not just boys, it's affecting girls and women too. And
Of course. The thing is, when you see suicide rates that say they dip a little bit, what you're usually going to see is overdose deaths are increasing. So it's not that despair is going backward, right? So if you're looking at suicide deaths, you better look at the overdose deaths too,
yeah,
because
they're all connected, right?
increasing.
And
Correct. It's
alcoholism
despair.
is another one.
It's despair.
Yeah.
What we're really talking about is the deaths of despair.
Correct.
And so it's in that despair that we really need to look. And I think we have done things, and I'm going to connect back to education too, right? We have marginalized boys. I mean, look, I cannot imagine calling an entire group of people toxic or calling them patriarchal, calling them all those types of things are awful terms, and they stereotype an entire group of people. And they're just not the type of terms that young men should have to honestly put up with. They should stand up and say, no, I'm not going to take this implicit bias test. I'm not going to do it.
This is something I talk about all the time. Is I'm 60 years old. as far back as I can remember, I've had to watch, for example, in the media, TV shows portraying men as idiots, or the women. I always talk about the Brady Bunch. If you go back and watch the Brady Bunch, the girls won every single time when there was a boys versus girls thing. It creates this mindset. We're teaching boys literally from birth that there's something wrong with them, to kind of use a phrase, or that they're to blame for everything. And I do believe that this creates this mindset that as they become teenagers and go through puberty, they don't feel human, in a manner of speaking. And I think that's part of the reasons we have the school shootings, because if you don't feel human, you're not going to view others as human. Again, it talk about drug abuse, um, teen pregnancy is part of it. The whole gamut of issues that are out there, I think, are all directly related to how we're showing boys that, they're somehow bad, when in reality they're human beings. What do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting. So, I mean, we're gonna get a little Freudian here. And so, Freud wrote about like the life instinct and the death instinct, and gravitating toward one and gravitating toward the other. And if you have no purpose, if you have despair, you will gravitate toward things that are, I'm going to call it the death instinct. I'll give you an example. Wrote about recently. 80-year-old guy in Oakland, you know, selling ice cream out of the little push cart. The little push cart
Mm-hmm.
on wheels, basically the freezer on wheels, right? He gets mugged of $120, and they drive off, right? So they take his money and they drive off, right? In that instance, you have two things going on there. You have the man who is um, working, trying to provide for himself, and doing. I mean, he's an 80-year-old man selling ice cream out of a pushing freezer, right? And then you have this other group that comes in and basically completely obliterates that. So you have one man who's fighting for life and another who's kind of taking it away.
Mm-hmm.
Groups who are taking it away. And so that's like this example of the life and death instinct functioning in our society. And we need to reward and encourage the life instinct. Men need to know that they are incredibly important to not only to the health of themselves, but to the health of their culture and their society, and the men and women in it. And the women need to feel the same way. But we need to create this society where men need to feel valued in every way, shape, or form. So, I've encouraged my sons that if someone wants to belittle you based on some immutable characteristic, to stop them. You don't have to put up with it. To say, I'm not going to tolerate
Mm-hmm.
being referenced as something. I'm an individual, and I'm kind. And I like helping people. Here's an example. So let's stop the nonsense. But men need to feel purposeful. And I think it's incredibly important that we begin that at a very early age. Um, you know, Boys are competitive. We're squashing competition. We are squashing things that really do appeal to boys and men. And in doing so, we are communicating very clearly that they're worthless.
Mm-hmm.
And also more importantly, like we really need to have fathers involved with their children in significant ways. And in instances where that's not the case, we have to kind of step in and figure out what we're going to do.
And that's one of the reasons that I do what I do. And one of my goals is to, as a 60-year-old, I started a new series recently called Advice from Dad, because
Nice.
I get inquiries all the time. I mean, there's a day goes by I don't have some young man message me with a question, and I said, you know what, I need to start addressing some of them and share the benefits of my wisdom, if you will, and my experience, because I went through those things. I know you went through those things. And we're also realizing that a lot of these boys grew up without fathers. So if I can help them out, it's one of the reasons I do what I do. And I think, to your point, by the way, about, we're trying to take away winners and losers, sports, we're not going to keep score. That's a huge mistake. It's something I'm vehemently opposed to, because I coached Pop Warner, I coached Little League. It wasn't about winning or losing per se. It's the lessons you learned from winning and losing. Because I'm sorry, I don't care how much you protect your kid, they're going to get out in the real world and they're going to lose. They're going to lose more often than they're winning in most cases. And if you don't know how to deal with that emotionally, mentally, even physically, you're just setting them up for a lifetime of issues, and the response being drugs, alcohol, and that. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think that getting boys more active is important in team sports. So for example, many of our schools today, I would actually encourage them to have multiple teams. So for example, I mean, I look at some of the school districts where you have 3,000 kids in a high school, and you're going to field one basketball team. Well, why do you have to field one? If you can field two, field two.
Mm-hmm.
There's local gyms nearby or share practice time or whatever. But that's ways to keep them engaged, because if not, they're going to get engaged in other things. And it's like you said, there's all the other things that you learn in team sports. And so these things are absolutely possible and can be done. But the drug addiction, these are all reactions to things. And honestly, I mean, we are encouraging a bit of a we are encouraging the behavior as well. I mean, kids will go onto Snapchat, right? Or they'll go onto social media and they'll get a Percocet
Mm-hmm.
because they want a Percocet, but they don't realize it's laced with fentanyl. And so, that happened to a young man at Santa Clara University, right? This isn't like one or two instances now. And so they're looking to drop out of life. And it's not just the manifestation of suicide and drug addiction and alcohol. They're not getting married, or they're not dating, or they're not getting jobs. They're constantly on the screen. And those types of things, we're not talking kids who are playing video games for fun with their buddies and have other activities, but we're talking about 30, 35-year-old grown men who are, no longer interested in forming relationships. So, and so one of the things I think that contributes to that too is I think can start at an earlier age is men we need to embrace aggression. So you're going to hear it here first time, Dan. I'm telling us we need to embrace aggression. Absolutely embrace it and distinguish it from violence.
And that,
And young men learn that aggression is great, but here's where it's different. I mean, Warren, I think, talks about this. I'll use his analogy. He talks about, father and son wrestling.
yes, I was just going to go there. Yeah.
Punch him in the nuts.
Yep.
It's, that's the off limits thing. But it's even something different than that. So aggression is what allowed us to survive for many, many years, right? Hundreds of years. But that, again, it's a distinction between that and violence. Anger is a healthy emotion. Violence is not.
Correct.
And so we need all these emotions. And when young men begin to learn, like, I'm aggressive, but at what point have I crossed the threshold? I think they should learn it at a very young age to distinguish between the two. And so they don't feel bad about themselves. So they realize this is normal. Because what leads to depression and despair and addiction and suicide and alcohol and alcohol addiction and drug addiction is someone who doesn't feel they matter.
And it goes to a couple of points, and we're kind of starting to morph into the family and fatherhood issue now, right, or lack thereof. It's when you remove the fathers from the home, even if they're actively involved post separation divorce, it's just not the same. I talk about this all the time. The standard order that's done in family court is dad gets every other weekend, and I call it the pizza date, the one night a week for dinner. And that's awesome that he's at least getting that. But that works out to about a 15% of the available hours in a week. I understand they're sleeping in school. I'm just trying to make this simple. Whereas mom gets the other 85. And I'm not trying to knock mothers in any way, but mothers cannot teach what fathers can any more than fathers can teach what mothers can. And we're losing that. And one of the big issues, and I know Dr. Farrell talks about this a lot in his books, is that by removing the fathers, we lose those teaching opportunities. He talks about, and this is something I remember when I first read it years ago that just hit home with me, is teaching the right and wrong and how dads are stricter, if you will. It's cut and dried. You screw up one time, you're pretty much done, right? You talk about if you get hit in the nuts, that's it. We're done playing. Whereas mom will go, don't do that again. Next time, And I'm not faulting mothers. That's just their way versus the way dads do it. And I think that's a huge issue that we're seeing. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you'll get different types of moms and dads, different types of parenting styles, right? And I think it's important to recognize you'll get both. But what I think is more important is recognizing the health of aggression and directed aggression,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so my boys would wrestle all the time, and my wife and I would talk about it. And like, look, they need to do this. That's how they're bonding as brothers. That's how they're showing their love and affection. And and then she would kind of get in on it. And I was really proud of her. Like she would like, tickle them and like, do the kind of stuff. And she was engaging in that energy, right? And so I think that was, wonderful. And so I think if we acknowledge what's going on with the boy, the mother and the father can recognize, hey, we need to, I need to get myself out of the way and then direct him to the right way,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that we can embrace that aggression. And so that's again gets back to, it's funny. I was just talking to a friend about this, that I would love to see, a course, in high schools and even really at the university level as an elective that would fulfill a requirement about boys and girls learn differently for people who are going to grow up and want to be parents one day. And so that they can learn about these things. But hey, I need to return to this, or I might need to return to this understanding that my boy needs this type of activity or my girl needs this type of activity. And there are plenty of assertive girls out there, right? But it's not going to be always at the same level, and it's going to express itself in a different way.
Yeah,
And so
I always
you're
argue
right.
that we're the same in many ways, but we also have our differences, and we need to acknowledge both of those circumstances, the
Of course,
similarities
like
and the
so
differences.
in my marriage, my wife is a high level executive, and she's really great at what she does, and she's strong and independent and a great leader. I do more of the kid stuff. I was a teacher, that kind of stuff. So, I coach sports and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, I mean, I recognize the importance of that aggression and how to manage it. My kids are not allowed to be mean to anybody else. You better not be violent to anybody else unless you're defending yourself. Other than that, your aggression is normal. Here's how you should express it, use it, do it. And that's what needs to become healthy. We've unfortunately as a culture, not I don't know if most people believe this, but we definitely enforce this as a culture that testosterone is a violence hormone. It is not a violence hormone, and that myth has to be debunked immediately. That's not what causes violence.
Do
Something else causes violence.
do you think it comes as a child? Do you think they take it differently from dads than moms when you could say the exact same things and you could be talking about the situations you're talking about? My personal belief and my experience is the boys will listen to the dad more about, hey, you can come to this point, but you're not going to cross it. Versus mom could say verbatim the same words. I don't think the boys react to it the same. What do you think on that?
Well, yeah, I think it depends on the parenting style, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I've known fathers who can like drop the hammer, and fathers who can't drop the hammer. But for the most part, I think you're right. I think that dad, like, I just say like, this is it. There's no argument here.
Mm-hmm.
It's very black and white. They need clear direct. If X happens, Y is a result. They're not going to have a 15-minute conversation about it. And so when talking with your son is incredibly important. But I tell you what, if it's a heated moment and let's pass a little bit, I would engage in an activity first. Throw a ball back and forth or shoot some hoops, get them physically moving, and all of a sudden the conversation will be better and far less heated than otherwise.
It's
And
funny
so,
you mentioned that, Sean, because I was just thinking like with my oldest son, and he had a lot of issues in school because he was too smart for it. To be honest with you, they didn't challenge him at all. They wanted to drug him and all that. But anyway, best conversations we had were shooting hoops in the backyard. And that whole dynamic of we might not talk for 5 minutes because we're playing, but then, hey, what about this? And we might talk for a couple minutes and we go back to playing. And just a different dynamic versus my then wife might have sat him down to have a conversation. And I'm not saying she's wrong. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's a different dynamic. It's a different approach. And I think, my belief is children benefit from both, right? But I do think that there's a different, almost an innate component to when dads communicate to sons, this is what it is. You're not going to cross this line. And there are moms that'll do that, but this is my personal belief, that it just comes across differently. And now that's not to knock or praise anyone. It's just, in my opinion, reality.
Well, and I think these are some of the things that are contributing to the mental health crises that we have. Because I want to get away, I want to stay focused on this, and I have that tendency, but part of it is the inability to accept these things in boys and men that are essential. There is something more in aggression, and how do we nurture it, deal with it? Aggression nurturance is really what we're talking about. And so I think it's important that becomes part of it, because if you bottle it up, it's going to expose itself, like a school shooting.
It's going to explode. You're not going to stop it.
And I think there's also boys who are who are a little more sensitive, right? They still have aggression, right? They still have it. And how does that person express his aggression? And so I really think that part of what's contributing to our challenges with boys today is that our schools have become reluctant to acknowledge them as wonderful entities the way they are, that your actions define you, and giving them purpose. So giving boys purpose, I'll give a perfect example. Women in STEM. Is there any school in the country at the K through 12 level that says, boys in nursing, or boys are teachers too? It just doesn't exist.
Not at all.
So, so what I'm saying is the messages they're getting is that they're lesser. And then we wonder why they have problems.
Yeah, that the term I use is they're othering them, right? They're dehumanizing them, if you will, because if nothing else, and I know Dr. Farrell talks about this, and I think Reeves talks about it, sense of purpose is what drives men and boys. We have to have something to strive for. Yes, there are exceptions. I will grant that, but I'm talking in general. Having something to work towards. You talk about on a football field, how can we make the play better, or how can we defend the play better? Things like that you learn in school. We want to put our hands on, the running joke I always use is, you'll always hear women say, men never look at the instructions. You're right, we don't, because we want to learn how to do it by doing it, making the mistakes. I remember back when I was a teen and tearing my car engine apart and putting it back together and having parts left over. But the damn thing started and still ran. But I learned from that. As opposed to, having the Chilton's manual and going page by page through it, which was what the schools would want me to do. It's that hands-on different approach that we need to be looking at, and getting both the schools to do it and society in general to say, boys are valuable. We need to make some adjustments to bring out the best in them, as opposed to trying to, I hate to say it this way, but I'm going to feminize them.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't emasculate a male. I don't want to do the same the other way. And so I think the challenge, and I want to get back to this, is fathers involved in their children's lives. I mean, if you haven't seen if people haven't seen the documentary Erasing Family, you can watch it for free online now. You should see the documentary Erasing Family by Ginger Gentile, because really looking at the family court system, so much money goes away from a child into the courts, and it's a nightmare. And really what we should be focused on is, how do we keep families together, except in extreme circumstances, right? And mother and father have to be involved, period. And it's healthier for the child. And the money would be better spent on therapy, and saying to the parents, look, you may be separating or you may be divorcing, but you can't bring your drama to your kid, period. And we can work through that through counseling separately or together or whatever. But we have to ensure that the mother and the father are involved in the children's life and they see that their actions are directly vested to the child so that the child is healthy. And parents can do that. I've known, all couples who are divorced and they've done an exceptional job, no matter how they felt about each other, they would sit next to one another during their child's game,
Hmm.
or they would put aside their frustrations and they would just do it. And they would say, I can do this for 2 hours. Right. And I think those are the types of conversations that need to happen. Those are the types of things. The money being spent in the court systems will be so much better spent on extracurricular activities for the kids, counseling for the kids and the parents if needed, and things like that. But the court system monies and the court systems are not prepared to really handle this situation. They're truly not. They're not updated on the science enough and the outcomes. They're just not.
That could be a whole separate show on just that. But
Exactly what I was
to your
doing that.
point, I remember this is a few years back having a conversation with a couple, and they were going to divorce, and I'm like, okay, and then I kept was friends with them, and over time they started battling, going to war, and they spent $100,000 between them. And I remember having the conversation with both of them individually later, going, because they both later on said, I wish we hadn't gotten divorced. I wish we had worked on our marriage. And I said, you spent $100,000 separating. Why weren't you willing to spend a few thousand, 3, 4, 5,000 on counseling? Because they wouldn't go to counseling. It's an investment. Now, will counseling work 100% of the time? No, it won't. But
But
you never know
even if
until you
it
try.
Yeah, if it doesn't and there's children involved, it should at least bring you to some kind of, again, we're talking about there's going to be irrational people out there.
Oh, absolutely.
There has to be, like, here are your choices, to the man or the woman. You're either going to do the counseling or you're going to go to family court. Which one is it? And they'll go
Yeah.
to the counseling.
Yeah. Well,
So,
yeah. I mean, if
so,
and that's the
you know,
thing is we don't have that conversation. Instead, one or the other usually goes to the divorce attorney, and you get the right attorney. They might say, "Hey, why don't you get some therapy first, then come back?" But most of them are going to go, "Well, here's what we're going to do," and drive that animosity. And the other issue with family court, to your point, though, is the courts are not prepared because the courts see it as an adversarial process. They'll never admit it. Family court judges will not admit it. I've talked to them. But it is an adversarial process. You're trying to beat up the other parent to quote unquote win custody, child support, all that stuff. There's no winner there. The biggest loser, of course, is the child, as opposed to looking at ways to change that and take that adversarial system away. And it goes into, there's a whole host of things that's a whole other show, but the primary importance that should be focused on is we need to fix removing the father from the children's lives because all of societal ills can be traced back to it, in my opinion.
yeah, no, and so much of it is. And if we can figure out, and I think even married couples who are getting divorced, if there is a way to work it out, I mean, there's a lot to be said for healing.
Mm-hmm.
And if there is a way to try to work at it, I mean, like your friend you had spoken about, I know so many couples like that where 7 years later, even though they went through the divorce kind of amicably, one of them ultimately says, like, what was I thinking?
Yep.
Right? Like, what was I thinking? Like, it really wasn't, when you're removed from something, right? You realize, well, maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought, or maybe it was a time. And actually, it's, with young couples too, right? Um, the hardest time, like when you start having kids, man, it's tremendous and it's a lot of work and
Yes,
it's
it is.
wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. And it too is just a blip of things. And I think that um, sticking together is really important when and that unless there are, like I said, extreme circumstances, you can probably pretty much work through anything. At one point you cared and you think about, the caring is still there, especially when the person is removed. And again, there are extreme circumstances. Not going to deny that. Um, but some of it is just, sticking together longer really does build the love.
Yeah, when you look at why people divorce, the majority of the time it's because one or another is just unhappy in general. It's not abuse. It's not cheating or all that. They do occur in place, but not to the level people think it is. And when you look at it as well, oh, he didn't do the, the housework, or she didn't do whatever. Those are things that maybe if we sat down and had a conversation or went through therapy or whatever, you got to at least give it a shot, and maybe you could fix things, as opposed to going, and I hear from, I'm going to be a sexist. Here we go. Women in particular, I hear all the time later on regret getting divorced because they believe they're going to find someone better. And then they find out, number one, the guy they had was pretty damn good. And two, another common one they'll throw at me is, yeah, I started listening to my friends and they were telling me how awesome it was being single. And then I found out I'm sitting home every Friday and Saturday night. And there's guys that go through the same thing. Before you get yourself in that position, my belief is you should do everything you can to save it, especially if you have children, because otherwise you're handing over six figures to a divorce attorney. You're making them rich. You're taking away from yourself and your children. And the data supports all that. And that's a question I have for you, is because I know you're talking to policymakers, you're collecting this data and talking about that. What happens when you bring that up to them? I'm curious.
I haven't gone as deep into that. We've really focused predominantly on the educational stuff, the deaths of despair and career employment stuff. And the male narrative in the public discourse is what I get at is really how social media and government pretty much ignores it. But to get to your point, I think that there should be. I think there are policymakers who would like to see a more robust nuclear family element for sure, and there are those who don't care one way or the other. Um, but I do think people who try to work it out really do benefit, and I do think the regret thing happens on both sides. I think, if a man was kind of problematic, really looks back, hopefully if he's self-reflective, says, man, what the hell was I thinking, and vice versa. So but I agree with you. I mean, there's not this period of you need to go through. Why don't you go through counseling? Why don't you go, like, there's some stages. I mean, we're just so prepared to do it, like, and I think that speaks to resilience. I mean, how we teach our children resilience if as adults we're not really resilient, right? And I think that plays an incredibly important role.
Again, it all kind of dovetails together, doesn't it? How
It's all connected.
it
So when you
is.
try to separate the issues,
You
it's
can't,
really
because
hard.
they're all intertwined and so deeply that you're never going to be able to separate them. Kind of going off the issue with the lack of fathers in the home and all that. I know one of the things that you guys are focused on is the criminal justice system, the court system, incarceration rates, and so forth. Can we kind of go over to that a little bit, but keeping in mind all the other stuff because it is intertwined? But what is you seeing with that? What is the work that you're doing on that?
Yeah, males who are incarcerated are overwhelmingly coming from fatherless homes. We know that. And so, in particularly in the Black community, right? It's over 70% of out of wedlock births, right? You have single parent homes. And so you don't have structure. And then usually that impacts the economics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if there's one provider, usually there are greater challenges financially. And that leads to all other sorts of things. But that is also true if you come from other family dynamics. Hispanic, white, Native Americans in particular are really hit hard. We never hear enough about them. They're particularly hit hard. But really, what you'll find is the common denominator is socioeconomic and family that leads to these sorts of, again, taking something like aggression and turning it into violence and into the life and the death instinct, which gets back to the marriage thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we rip the family, it's destructive. It's destructive to the life instinct, because the life instinct is to stay together in harmony, right? And the death instinct is to kind of go against that function. And so I would kind of tie it back into that we were saying earlier. But the incarceration stuff happens again for purposeless men, right? And we need to give them purpose at a very young age. But that's what you find and we also have to accept something. We're putting men into prisons who are mentally ill. And this gets back to our mental health component, I
Mm-hmm.
guess I wanted to touch on earlier. That I guess I'm coming back to it because I really wanted to. But we need to reestablish mental health institutions in this country in a very significant way. Really, since the Kennedy administration, mental health institutions have been closing. So now you have homeless people who get into crime and end up in jail, who should maybe be in a mental health institution. And so it's all this being intertwined. But health institutions in this country started closing, and the goal was to have more smaller units outside that would serve as vehicles to help integrate the mentally ill into the community. And that's not what happened. What the programs never established and were never really part of the structure. So what you end up getting is all these homeless people who are mentally ill and committed crime. That's not all of them, right? But we have to accept as a society that there is going to be a certain number of people who are going to need services. That just is how it is.
Mm-hmm.
We can't leave them on the streets homeless and mentally ill. As for again, we need to promote amongst young men the importance of the life instinct, that your job is a protector. And men are protectors. And it doesn't mean women aren't protectors. They're absolutely protectors. You watch a mother with her child, she's an absolute protector. Men are protectors in different ways too. And we need to tell us, like, when you do X, that is not socially acceptable. That you, as a protector, you have a role to be a protector. And I think, again, I can't imagine, or I don't think I've ever heard that in any school ever. I'd love to hear first graders and second graders here, you're a protector. And it's not a degradation of anybody else. It's a fact. And so when we look at the incarceration rates, it's often, fatherless men, single homes. Often there could be abuse. There's usually, turning to other things, and drugs, alcohol, and destructive behavior. And again, an inability to understand how their aggression really should be directed, right? And so the incarceration problem is real, and there are people out there really committing crime. And why is that happening? And we need to get to the before. We need again preventative medicine, right? Not after the fact.
Yeah, that's the point I've tried to make in the past, is that when you look at incarceration, and I don't remember the exact number, but I'll use 80% of it is male. And when you start looking at why are, or who, I guess is the better way to put it, who is incarcerated, fatherlessness is right up there. And education's another one. Again, it all dovetails together. And to your point, I'm an advocate of the more we can address issues, for example, making sure the boys are engaged in school, having the father around, the incarceration rates will plummet. Now, some will argue they don't want that because people make a ton of money off the prison system. Um, Set that aside, but if we want to have an honest conversation of how to reduce the amount of imprisonment, it's got to start with those things. Is we need to address the issues that men and boys are facing on all levels. And the more we do that, then naturally we will reduce the incarceration rate, because it will give that, like we talked earlier, that men a sense of purpose. So if they have a good quality sense of purpose versus, dad's not there, I'm looking for a father figure, I'm going to go join a gang. And then within the gang, that sense of purpose is we're going to sell as many drugs as we can. And next thing you know, the kid's in prison. That's what I'm talking about. And when you try and have conversations with legislators about it, right over their head, or they know it, but they don't want to deal with it. What are you seeing?
Oh, it's incorrigible that we allow homeless people um, and support essentially their drug addiction and their mental health.
Oh, it's insane.
It's incorrigible that we do it as a society, that we allow, which over 70, you're 7% of your homeless are male. 90, I think it's 93% of the incarcerated are male.
Okay.
I think that's what Warren had in the book. And I'm just getting ready to look at that data because I look at it through states, so it depends on state to state. But generally speaking, you're looking at 85, 90%. And so, we allow people to live on the streets homeless, facilitating their drug use in some cities more than others. And we think this is okay. And it's not. Again, it's a promotion of this kind of death instinct. And we need to deal that we can't allow people to live homelessly. We just can't. And I don't think incarceration is the issue, but something is. And if they, and there's a lot of mental health services that would help, I think, alleviate a lot of this. The other thing is getting our boys to be able to function in school without ADHD, ADD medication. Because what we're really done, and there are instances where you're going to need it, but it's way over medicated. And so from a very young age, we're getting young men hooked onto things that are mood altering,
Mm-hmm.
very young age. Now there are extreme circumstances, but not nearly as much as we prescribe, and that's pretty well documented. So I think, we have to begin by looking at the prison system, and the preventative medicine necessary. And it really begins again. We go back to our schools. If you have a child and there is no father in the picture, and there'll be a lot of reasons there's not a father in the picture, and that the school needs to know immediately, like in the family, and that this person is already vulnerable. Not in all cases, but there's a reason the majority of the incarcerated, or there's a healthy, are coming from single parent homes.
You bring up an interesting point that, with regard to homelessness, say, the fix in my area is we just need to build more homes, and that's going to solve the problem. We've got to give them places to go. Okay, that's a fair point. They do have to have a place to go. But if we don't address the underlying causes other than they don't have a place to go, which is rarely, at least in my experience, and I've talked with people that work with the homeless, they'll say it's not that they don't have a place to go, they don't want to go. They're dealing with a mental illness almost always. Um, and there's nothing out there to address that as far as within, at least locally in my communities and the local governments that are looking at that. They don't want to have that conversation. They want to go, we're going to build 50 units and we're going to get 50 people off the streets. It doesn't work. It never has worked. It's never going to work. And that's not me saying that. That's people I know working to try and help the homeless go. And they're sticking a Band-Aid on a gaping wound because they're not addressing the underlying issue, which is almost always mental illness, which leads to drug use, which is the other part of it, and so on. And again, I want to get your thoughts on how do we fix that, or more precisely, how do we get the narrative changed on that, so that, because it is primarily a male issue again, how do we get that changed?
We have to invest in mental health, flat out. I mean, we have to reinvest in mental health institutions in a big way. There's a direct correlation between the closing of mental health institutions and homelessness. All right, that exists. And so we just have to invest, and there will be people who will have to be in those facilities, and they can maybe go to some kind of a satellite operation where they can function in society a little bit, and they may have to go back. And that's just something I think we have to bear. And that's part of the solution. But we need to reinvest, not say, hey, there are people who have a very hard time and may not be able to function in society, and we have to try to help them. And that may mean living in a mental health institution, not like the ones we saw in the 1950s, right? But some of them actually did a good job. And I think it's important that we return to that understanding that living on the street, you go to the Tenderloin in San Francisco, and it's something out of a zombie apocalypse. And so I think that it's important that we recognize it, deal with it, and invest in mental, because you're paying, people know you're paying for it anyway. You're paying for it in increased home insurance. You're paying for it in increased car insurance. You're paying for it in increased services. You're paying for it anyway. This is coming out of your pocket one way or the other. But I think, again, it's a promotion of the life instinct as a society if we acknowledge the fact that there are people who are mentally ill, and they need assistance, and it's better for society to have it.
And
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 that's how we do it. We big time invest in mental health.
and the money's already there to do it. All we have to do is take it out of the prison system. We spend billions every year putting prisoners in prisons. I'm in North Carolina. The number is somewhere around $30,000 a year to house an inmate, times X number of inmates. Imagine if we invested that 30,000 ahead of time so that they don't go to prison, imagine what could be done, right? And
Yeah,
the,
and getting those guys who are imprisoned, I mean, for really serious violent crime, they may never be able to
oh,
get
there's
out.
always, of course.
There's always going to be that. But what about, I mean, and we're all talking about learning a trade and all that kind of stuff, but it has to lead to something. Like if they're going to become a welder in prison, it's going to lead to a job,
Hmm.
right? Or whatever it may be. And so we all public these work programs and what have you, but it actually has to lead to something meaningful. You actually have to come out with purpose. And that person may need to live um, in a kind of institution and work and go back and forth and have some free time and all of that. It is I mean, we're talking about very loosely, but much like you, I've talked to mental health professionals, and this is something that's not fixed. Oh well, now that they're out, they can do this and live on their own. They may be in and out, in and out, and that's what people don't understand is that some people's mental illness will require constant monitoring. And there'll be times when they're going to be fine. And there's times when they're going to be like, hey, we need to return them to the mental health institution because, they're off their meds and all that. And so they're not just going to the emergency room. So there is monitoring, like real live monitoring, which they can do. And when those violations are broken, they may have to return to an institution for some period of time. That's
But
it.
but if we change to a more preventative mindset as opposed to a
Yeah, for
punitive
sure.
one, that's going to go a long way towards solving it. And again, it all dovetails together. It begins in childhood because a lot of what's happening in their 20s and 30s was ingrained at 5, 6, 7 years old. I hate to say it, but they don't want to acknowledge that, but it goes, when it's funny because every topic we've talked about, they all come together over and
Here's
over
what
and
I would
over
like
again.
to ask, and I would love to do. It's like there was a video of the man from Oakland who sold his ice cream and ultimately was robbed. Um, and if you showed that video to, you know, every high school student in America, how many would laugh and how many would say, I don't mean the kind of laughter that's nervous laughter. How many would laugh and how many would say, we cannot allow that as a society. I cannot do that. No one can do that. And I say that only because I taught at high school. And I think kids would look at it and some of them would laugh.
You
And I
got me
think some
thinking now. I think I'm going to postulate the majority of them would laugh.
and say, how many of you look at that and say,
Yeah.
or when you look at people breaking into a store and saying, why do we justify it? And what I'm really getting at is choices that you can make that I'm not going to do that. That like people who are hungry and you're working hard and you're hungry, you can find food. You go to a church, you go to a place of worship. They'll help you. There are places out there. And when I look at these kinds of things and people, robbing jeans and TVs or again, and the only reason I'm bringing this up is there's a permissible culture. And we should look at that video of the man who's being robbed and say, this is just unconscionable as a society. And talk about why it's wrong. Why can't kids talk about why is that so wrong? Let's not talk about justifying. Let's talk about why it's wrong.
Yeah, let's have a conversation, right? And if they want to have the conversation about justifying it, also, I don't have a problem with that. But let's talk about exactly what you said, why it's wrong. You mentioned San Francisco, and as an East Coaster, if I may now, we look at that and go, what are they thinking out there? No offense to you or anyone in California, but y'all be nuts. Um, I'm joking, but I love San Francisco. I used to go to San
Great
Francisco
city.
for work. I loved it there. I would have lived there if it wasn't so expensive. Thank God I didn't. I look at it now because it goes to what you're talking about. There's no accountability at any level. And if the government's not even holding
That's what
people
men want.
accountable, yeah,
Young men want
exactly,
accountability. They
exactly,
actually want structure. They
yes,
function better in structure. It's they really truly do. It's very funny. Um, they really do. And I think that's what we're yearning for. And I think that's what they're yearning for. I think they are yearning for a purpose. And that purpose is look, you need to be a protector. And then protector is a very, when I say protector, that means, not engaging in the type of activity that is hurting somebody else. And I don't mean physically, but in other ways.
Right.
Right. And so that's what a protector does. He protects society. That's what the protector does.
And my argument has always,
Cultural norms.
yeah, my argument has always been that boys will seek out that guidance to be the protector. And they're either going to seek it out from their father, or if the father is absent or been removed, they're going to look for it elsewhere. Hopefully, it's another positive male figure in their life. But I'm sorry to say, more often than not, it's other kids, gangs, that type of thing. They are looking for that structure. And we need to acknowledge that as a society and accept that, which we're not really even willing to have that conversation right now. And it kind of dovetails too, because we've gone way over, but I'm going to keep going if you don't mind, my friend. If you've got a few more minutes, I
Sure.
want to get into the narrative, the narrative about men and all that, because that's something else you're addressing and looking into, and I don't want to miss out on that because I think that's as important, possibly more so than many of the other things we've talked about. On the surface level, what are your thoughts on the narrative and why it is what it is and what its effect is by being where it is now?
Well, the male narrative is constructed around special interest. And so when I say, the male, I'm speaking specifically about media, government, and education specifically. Um, and so, if you go to almost any article, and if there is some kind of catastrophe in general, if they don't talk about death in terms of gender, um, it's overwhelmingly usually male and things like that. But we don't even um, we just don't present male information in education, which means it's not present in media, which means it's not present in government. And so all this is connected, of course. But what we don't do is we don't talk about it. We don't when I have conversations about a topic impacting boys and men, I will inevitably get the question that is off topic. It's a little bit of bait and switch.
Mm-hmm.
There's an inability to stay focused on the topic. And that's partly because there's large special interest groups. In the state of California, there is a California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls. I went to the conference last year, does really good work, important work, receives $12 million in 2 years. She received $12 million. There is no California Commission on the Status of Boys and Men, despite the fact that there's 77% of the opioid deaths, 80% of the suicide deaths, over 70% of the alcohol deaths. They are outnumbered in colleges by significant margins. In 2021, there were 200,000 fewer males with college degrees between the ages of 24 to 35, and 98,000 fewer males with college degrees between 18 and 24. And so you're looking at 300,000 in that age group,
Mm-hmm.
in those age groups combined. Despite those realities, there is no interest in creating a commission on the status of boys and men to report to the legislature every year on how they're doing. And I actually see it personally as a violation of equal protections. That you have decided that there is a group of people who deserve protections, and they do, but another group who does not. The phrase that we're really hearing here a lot now is protected and unprotected classes.
Mm-hmm.
Or protected classes is what you talk. They don't say unprotected classes. And I say to people, well, if there's a protected class, there's an unprotected class. I want you to tell me what that individual looks like. Those individuals. What does unprotected look like? Explain it to me. And they can, because in reality, then you're violating equal protections. And so I think that is something we have to get at when we talk about like equity. So to me, equity means if there's an Office of Women's Health or a Commission on Women, there should be one, there should be the other. So we can look at distinct issues. Now you could argue whether these things should exist or not. That's a fine argument. But what you cannot argue is that there's a group that should be protected and there's a group that should be unprotected. And so the male narrative in the public discourse is suffocated in great part by special interest, media, government, and education.
Yeah, and it's been going on for decades, right? We
One more
talk.
thing now. So, for example, Fire did this. Those who are most likely to be silenced for free speech on college campuses are male.
Oh, I already I could have told you that one ahead of time.
65, 70%,
Yeah.
regardless of the political point of view. Of
Well, you see it also on social media. So,
course.
when you look at those that advocate for women's rights or women's issues and all that, they can do and say whatever they want. I've lost 3 accounts on TikTok, and I'll grant one of them absolutely deserved the ban. Hand to God, yep, I deserved it. The other times, not a chance. I just got dinged last week for pointing out basically a very common issue that men deal with, but we can't have that conversation because what happens is the women's groups then go and mass report it. It's a whole other thing, not to get too far into it, and get me silenced for that. It's that narrative. We're going to allow the feminist women's, however you want to phrase it, narrative, but we're not going to allow the men's, and it's creating huge issues. All the issues we've talked about prior to this, and it does also, I believe, drive public policy. You talk to politicians, the line they'll use often is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And when you have Hollywood, this you might be interested in this. About a week ago, I did a little experiment, and I sat down. I don't watch a lot of live TV, but I said, you know what? I'm going to take 3 hours. I'm going to sit down and watch live TV. So I watched the nightly news, local and national, and then I watched 2 hours of TV programs, and I tracked within those 3 hours the commercials, everything that was said during the newscast, and all that. And I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but it was somewhere in the neighborhood of, in that 3 hours, I saw 22 positive interactions, we'll call them, for women. One negative, and that negative really wasn't that negative, but I wanted to find one because I didn't want it to be zero. Conversely, on the other side, it was the exact opposite for men. It was something like 15 negatives, and I believe it was 3 positives in a 3 hour period. When you have that day after day, week after week for literally 50 years now, that drives the public narrative. It drives then the policymakers who are responding to that. I just want to get your thoughts on all that.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. Like if you look at films or movies and you look at, couples who are hitting one another, is overwhelmingly in film, it is women who are hitting men.
And it's considered funny when they do.
It's funny.
Yep.
Exactly. It's funny. It's not Three Stooges funny, right? But yeah.
I always
And
talk
so
about The King of Queens. Do you remember that show?
yeah, exactly.
That
Yeah.
show was an advertisement for domestic abusers who happen to be female to attack their men. Because if you go watch that show, emotionally, physically, mentally, he was being abused in every show. And
Well, I'll
boy,
tell you what's interesting too. And yeah, I put that for young women too, is to think about this. If you go to like high schools and you see, the boys and girls are flirting with one another, a girl will slap a boy, usually on the shoulder, like stop it, right? Like,
mhm,
but flirting. And the boy would never do that because he would be expelled or suspended in the moment. And it's just there's, and I don't want anyone touching anybody,
right.
right? So, um, but there is an inability. It's not an inability. I mean, there is so much money and special interest, government aid, and policy um, directed to the advocating for women. And I'm not saying they shouldn't exist either. What I am saying is that it's not reciprocal. And so much of what's happening in the field of education, not necessarily the field of education, I should say the universities, is really not in any way, shape, or form looking at outcomes of males. And if they are, it's because there's something wrong with them.
Hmm.
Not that there's something external force. And the converse is not true. When women are suffering, and it's true, and this I would agree with, is there's an external force. And probably that's true, right? But you can't have it one way or the other, right? We're all human. We're all impacted, but there are absolutely external forces on our boys and men. And I think the perfect example is the 89% of the suspensions in K through 3
Right.
in California are boys. I don't know what you're doing And I know what you're doing in K through 3, and it's innocuous stuff, and you're being suspended.
And
And
that's why
that's part of the challenge.
that's why I made the argument earlier that a lot of the things that cause boys to go to prison in their 20s and 30s occurs when they're in that age group, right? It's they're they're being conditioned, if you will, and their response a lot of times is a lot of them will become docile because of it, but a lot of them are going to respond with that aggression we talked about, right? Well, if you're going to suspend me anyway, well, I'm going to keep doing it because why not? And that sends the message. It's
And if your career and your marketing and your finances are dependent on a particular viewpoint, I don't see many people, um, celebrity types coming out and saying, we are failing our sons, and here's how we're doing it. There's no money in it. We don't do it. But it happens in the educational system, which is really sad. The universities are not doing a good enough job. And honestly, I would really have to say that the American Psychological Association has to do considerably more for boys and men. I don't think it's doing nearly enough.
I'd argue in many cases it's not doing a damn thing, to be honest with you.
Probably true.
I mean, I'm going to be blunt about it. We have had quite the conversation, my friend. We've gone
Thank you,
quite a
Dan.
while. We covered a lot. I do want to kind of get a closing thought from you on basically, where we're at now and what do you see over the next 5 to 10 years and what should be the primary focuses? If you can give me like 3 minutes on that.
I think every mother in America should be looking at the outcomes of boys and men, and they should be saying, "I'm not going to tolerate it anymore." That's what I think. And there are many mothers who agree with that. But
I
I really love to see them act on it in a really positive way. Getting involved and saying, "I just want to know the truth. I don't want to compromise my own well-being or my daughter's well-being. I'm certainly not going to allow my son's well-being." And that son may be 50, and that son may be 6. But there are plenty of mothers out there who I would love to see take this on more of an issue, and force policies change. And I think that's incredibly important. That is, I think, one of the most important things we can do in the next 5 years is reach out to mothers more, um, of sons. The second thing is that we have to fight. Honestly, some of this has to be done legally. I think that there's been a lot of success with Title IX on college campuses, and because people don't understand this, Title IX is against sex discrimination, and there are men who are being discriminated against, and there's been a lot of success with Dr. Mark Perry, who's sued universities for violating equal protections under Title IX for men, and he's been successful in doing that. For example, female-only scholarships and things like that. And so I think it's important that that type of thing happen. But I think the courts, believe it or not, sadly, is a place some of this has to happen. I think if parents are not getting results, which I know you can prove pretty easily, that the male gender gap in educational outcomes is happening, that I think parents should go after school districts and say, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. And we're going to look for solutions. And school choice is probably somewhere we have to go. I don't know if I would have thought that 20 years ago, but I absolutely believe that school choice plays an integral role now, because parents shouldn't have to just go where they're slated. And especially when the outcomes are poor. And some schools may be better at actually working with kids who are disadvantaged and using their resources in a better way. And so I think those are some things we absolutely have to be looking at. And again, I don't know if I would have thought that years ago, but I think it's important that we start looking at those choices. The other thing is we have to have it like things like an Office of Men's Health. Like these things I just have to happen.
mm-hmm.
And again, if you're a daughter who has a father, or you have a brother, or you're dating someone, or you're two men who are in love with one another, and you are not seeing any sort of um, advocacy on your behalf, you should be pretty frustrated and say this is unacceptable. And who's going to support that effort? And so I think going forward, I do actually think now school choice is important, and I didn't think that before. And I do think that um, because it will force the hands to change. And then I also think that we have to look at lawsuits where they are being successful and violations of equal protections, which are happening rampantly throughout the country.
Mhm. I agree with everything you said. So I'm just going to stay quiet on that part. One thing I do want to do, because you are a 501c3, so how can people find out more about your organization and support the work that you're doing?
So this is the ask, which is tremendous. So if you could go to gibm.us and hit the donate button, that would really be tremendous because the money goes toward research and advocacy. So, for example, we were very fortunate to receive donations that we will be presenting a state report at the University of New Mexico on September 28th. And we're working with Sigma Alpha Epsilon, which is a fraternity, male fraternity nationwide. And they are now becoming much more involved in the outcomes of boys and men, deeply concerned. And I think that if you can support our efforts at gibm.us/donate, that would really help. It generally takes us about 60 hours to do a state report, so it's an enormous amount of work. But we do know that our reports are having an impact. And also, please go to inhiswords.us, and that is